Okay, so when talking about Cezanne, you talked about kind of the artist's peculiar preoccupations and problems and neuroses becoming kind of predominant in the work, and this becomes especially so in the modern era, where we have the temptation scenes, which are portrayed increasingly kind of ambiguous or not as to whether Anthony is going to win out in the end and on which side the artist is. We'll look at specifically Salvador Dali's and Max Ernst, which, despite being kind of distinctively modern, both have precursors, as I see it, in earlier pieces.
Those paintings are actually one of two of 12 works that were commissioned of the surrealists in 1945 for a film to be made based on Guy de Maupassant's Bel Ami. And it was supposed to be a certain size. It was going to be featured in the painting, and a number of these surrealists participated. Dali, it's the only competition he ever entered, and he lost to Max Ernst. The difference, I mean, something very important has happened since the 19th century's struggle with the question of the temptation of St. Anthony. The 19th century, as these artists are struggling, their concerns are a little bit more along the lines of, well, will people buy my work? Am I going to be popular? Am I going to be ostracized? Am I going? I mean, the 19th century's issues are not. They're a little bit more intellectual than they are physical. The intervening years from, let's say, the death of Cezanne to the competition in 1945 see the world change tremendously. And if the idea of temptation and horror, you know, the worst thing that can happen to you in a Cezanne painting is that you're going to be, or Domenico Morelli or some of these other, you know, 19th century painters, you know, you're going to find yourself in the arms of this, you know, sort of cream puff colored woman, you know, gosh, that looks pretty horrible. And even the idea of that Bosch gives us, if you fall for this temptation, the eternal damnation, you don't really see that in these works. You don't see the consequences of falling for temptation. But the 20th century ushered in an era that really described horrors. The First World War and the loss of life in the trenches, and the Second World War and the atomic bomb, which had a huge impact on people like Salvador Dali in particular. The diseases like the Spanish flu, which wiped out, you know, thirds of populations in some places. The Freud and that focus on the inward turbulence and muckraking of the psyche. So as opposed to, you know, when you went to look inwards, until for many years the church taught us to look inwards and, you know, deal with sin and virtue and the search for salvation. Now we have Freud, who is bringing us into wallowing into our deepest desires. And so this is what Ernst and Dali have to draw on when they are producing a whole new type of temptation, which, yes, will have its roots in the Bosch, in the figures that are chimeric, or in the kind of cluttered intensity of the scene, but really with a kind of new type of hard-edged horror that really brings a whole new element into temptation. And I think, if you don't mind, I think we might as well start with Max Ernst,
Yeah,
who
I
is
think
the one
so.
who
Yeah.
actually won the competition with his image of the temptation of St. Anthony, who at this point, it might take a second for the viewer to find him. He's that big swath of red at the very bottom. And as you were saying, these new images, you're not really sure how this is going to work out, right? We don't have the image of Anthony fixated on the side of the crucifix or looking away, or as you've pointed out in many of those images, looking calm in the face of temptation. Here we have the throbbing red color. I mean, this is a man who the
Right.
color of passion, the color of the viscera, the color of, I mean, this is a man who is pulsing in temptation. And as a matter of fact, you see one creature is sitting, on his chest. Another is pulling at his eyes and his face, and another one is pulling at his groin. So he's, stretched across the lower part of the canvas in the
Yeah.
throes of this temptation, and it's not very clear who's going
Yeah,
to
it's
win
disturbing.
here,
His face is
right?
kind of a gray-green color. He's kind of in agony here, being tortured and molested by these creatures.
And I think also the way that there's something kind of impish. The word impish comes. There's nothing impish here. These things are really, they are monstrosities. There's nothing kind of like, oh, that'd be sort of cute to have in a cage in my room. These things would get them away from me. And look at what he's using as colors. His colors
Right.
are unnatural. I mean, the sky is the
Hmm.
color of toxic waste. This metal, the representation of these
Yes.
colors that are very
Yes.
metallic, the world of machines and constructions and bits and pieces that are put together to make things that kill and destroy. It's very, very, very,
Yeah, I mean it's like a nightmare of a dentist appointment. Those metallic kind of claws. It's like being tortured by scientific implements or
particularly with
something.
since the one of them's got like its claws in the mouth of Anthony. That's particularly poignant statement. And then sort of to add to it, you have that like still water. The water is calm, and on the other side it looks like, maybe it might be better over there. It's a very kind of uh, 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 right up in the foreground is where you have this crunching. It seems like just you can almost imagine the sounds of the click click clicks and the crunch 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 and the grinds grind grind that are chewing away at him. And you kind of want to
Right.
get over to the other side. And again, just like Bosch did, there's really nothing tempting about this temptation. It's not like that voluptuous woman of Cézanne, or there are a million of them. We didn't really talk about these, but there are a million sexy versions
Right.
of Saint Anthony, where it's like, yeah, but this is not
Right.
that. This is really less of a temptation to the voluptuousness or gluttony. Really, it's a temptation to despair.
Yeah. There's a similar one though from the 15th century. Niklaus Manuel Deutsch, which I think is
Yes.
the closest to
Yeah.
this that I've
Yeah.
seen. Both in terms of the colors and the kind of
Yeah.
hard to make out nature of these creatures, kind of hard to distinguish one from the other. So yeah, you mentioned kind of there's these tend to go in the modern era in the direction of the lascivious or the blasphemous or both. I mean, we won't show these, but there's one by Felician Rops, which is very,
Yes.
it's interesting. It's
Very.
it's
Yeah.
got it does convey something real about the way that the devil, you read, I think a lot of us as Catholics have had this experience of being kind of mocked. If we're not going to give into temptation, then the devil will just kind of try to annoy us with horrible images, sometimes blasphemous thoughts. And, you read about this in, Saint Faustina experiencing this, for example, just off the top of my head. And I think this is a pretty common experience for people. And his painting does get at something of that. The only thing is that I get the impression that he's more on the side of the blasphemer than the person who's being tempted, especially
Yeah.
because if Saint Faustina were telling about this, she wouldn't want to show you the image and put it in your head. So and then
Right.
another one. There's a number of really lascivious ones, especially starting in the 19th century. But yeah, there's another one by well, I forget the name of the artist, and it doesn't matter. But there's a lot of those where the lasciviousness is really played up, and I think that first one by Cezanne is like right on the edge of that. I think the final version is less so, less kind of like violently erotic, but. Yeah, so you see a lot of that. But we're going to go to Dali, which is very modern and very Dali, but it is a more traditional in its spirit, actually, I think.
I actually was glad. I'm glad to close on Dali because I think Dali is kind of the opposite of Ernst. Dali runs into trouble when he starts producing. He loses a lot of his fan club when he starts producing religious art because Dali takes it seriously. Dali moved to Rome in the 1940s. And besides being utterly fascinated with the development of cinema and cinemascope, his paintings become much more wide angle. You can feel it in this painting too. It's this really big sort of panoramic type lens. But he also experiences a religious conversion. He finally marries Gala, and he really, thinks about what it's kind of like Cezanne. Interestingly, I forgot to mention this before. Cezanne, by the end of his life, he lived in Aix, and his room was like a room of Saint Anthony. He had just a bed in a room. Granted, I think Anthony slept on the rocks, but he had a bed in a room and a cross. And he really did, by the end of his life, live as an ascetic himself. This Cezanne, very, very interesting that this whole entire life is struggling, and he ends up with this transformation. And the same thing happens with, not exactly represented the same way, but Dali also experiences a tremendous religious conversion during this period. He really wants to represent images that allow him to explore his faith. Now, obviously, Dali being Dali, he's not really going to go for your typical. He's going to be looking for a certain type of imagery, and so he's particularly fascinated with the images of visions. So you have the wonderful, wonderful image of Saint John of the Cross, the painting of Jesus seen from above. He's very interested in things that are connected to the atomic age, so kind of taking things apart and putting them back together again. And here, in this particular temptation of Saint Anthony, he kind of reverses everything. This time, the creatures seem to be flying in the air, and Anthony is rooted to the ground, right? So we have these sort of strange, spindly-legged horses and elephants that are making their way through a desert to him, and then he kneels on the ground and very forcefully holding them back by lifting up the cross. So as opposed to the Ernst where we see Anthony completely prey to these creatures, here we see the powerful stand of the saint against these seemingly overwhelming things that have nothing to do with nature. And so you see the obelisk, which obviously he saw quite a few of in Rome. You see the nude woman, which I honestly, you can't have a painting by Dali without having some sort of voluptuous female figure in the nude. You have the horse, which among many different things, but we've seen the horses appear before, and also a symbol of pride, of wrath. And the other sort of the tower in the background, which is very evidently phallic, and then another city sort of sitting on another cloud in the distance. So this parade of the temptations, one after the other. And that a little teeny tiny bit also echoes Flaubert's way of writing about it. When we read the Life of Saint Anthony by Saint Athanasius, it's kind of, something happens and then it's calm for a little bit, and then something happens and then it's calm for a little bit. In Flaubert, it's nonstop. It's literally like one of those action movies where you're about an hour and 10 minutes into the movie and you're like, could somebody just stop and like have a coffee for a second? It's just, the action is so constant. He falls out of one immediately into another, and you get that sense that this is the moment before the onslaught of one thing after another in the Dali, and it adds in this image, and this is what makes it very beautiful, this hope and this, no more than hope, a certainty that you were talking about this before with Bosch, about how Anthony turns around and says, just remember, you make the sign of the cross, and you've got this. And he gives you that certainty. And so it's lovely to have this artist who's been associated with so many very peculiar ideas, seemingly almost like the slave of Freud, who worked his way through the visceral to finally understand that the great strength against temptation, the great strength against any onslaught is actually that confidence of faith.
I've read people tend to interpret his nakedness as kind of a sign of like his only defense is the cross. He's weak in himself, and he's rooted
Absolutely.
on this rock, you know, which obviously is like the rock. And yeah, as you say, it's a good place to end, as compared to Max Ernst.